going to be Gina Liberty. Janina is our harmful blue-green algal leader for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. Gina's background, she's got a BS in biology and a master's in resource ecology management from the University of Michigan. And she's been with the department forever, like 25 years. I've known this lady.
20 years, Buzz.
It says 25 here, but
Well,
we'll give you 20. Anyhow, and our other presenter is going to be Amanda Pope. Recently completed a applied epidemiological fellowship, and she's an epidemiologist and research analyst with Wisconsin Department of Health Services, Division of Public Health. She has her bachelor's in biology also and a master's in public health epidemiology. And a portion of her work really is dealing with blue-green algal bloom. So I'm going to turn it over to Gina. She's going to be for our first half of the presentation, and Amanda will cover the second half.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Buzz, and thanks everyone for joining us this morning. Well, I'm going to start out first with a little bit of terminology. So when I use the word cyanobacteria, that's actually exactly the same as blue-green algae. Cyanobacteria are lumped in with other true algae, which you see pictured on the right here, just by virtue of them having chlorophyll and doing photosynthesis. So cyanobacteria are actually true bacteria that can do photosynthesis. You can see some here, they can grow in colonies or filaments, and then there are some that also have specialized cells that you see here. It's a heterocyst that they can use for nitrogen fixation. So if I use the word cyanobacteria, that's exactly the same as blue-green algae. And when I talk about blooms, what a bloom is essentially is when you have conditions that cause cyanobacteria to grow to excessive or nuisance levels. And I might use the acronym HAB, and that's just, that means harmful algal bloom. One thing I want to point out, there's not really an official quantification for gauging when the growth of cyanobacteria gets to be bloom level. I'll talk about that. So planktonic cyanobacteria are those that are sort of free floating in lake water, and you can have planktonic blooms that look like this, sort of really, really green water in a lake. And sometimes you get concentrations that are really high that lead to these pea soup concentrations that you see right here in the middle. You see the streakiness from wind blowing those floating cyanobacteria around. So this would be a planktonic bloom, really green water or these pea soup type conditions. And if you have very calm weather, you can have planktonic scums developing. Cyanobacteria float. Calm weather allows them to accumulate near the surface of the lake, and you can have what looks like spilled latex green paint, swirly paint, sometimes really vivid colors as blooms start to decompose. And spilled paint really is sort of a classic description of some of these planktonic scums that can develop. You can also have blooms that are just from wind-driven accumulations. So cyanobacteria are in all water bodies in Wisconsin, and if you have calm enough weather that allows planktonic cyanobacteria to float to a lake surface, and then you have winds that push them all into one area, you can get situations like these. Here you can see a lot of other plant materials been pushed in close to shore too, and this is a band of floating cyanobacteria right close to shore. Here you see a green band of cyanobacteria that have been pushed in by wind too. So you can get these wind-driven accumulations too. These can happen in any water body in Wisconsin. But these tend to be very patchy and aren't always very, very long-lived. You can also, in really clear, shallow, quiet areas of lakes, have cyanobacterial mats growing on the bottom. And sometimes these will float to the surface, so you might consider these a bloom as well. So you have these floating globs that have come up off the bottom. Here's a really bright teal green mat, a brown one, and here in this picture on the lower left, these purple mats are cyanobacterial mats that have come up off the bottom. So floating mats might be considered a bloom as well. And the name blue-green algae really is sort of a misnomer. When cyanobacteria are actively growing, they're actually mostly green in color. You get these pea soup appearances when the really dense, tiny particles in water when you have an actively growing cyanobacterial bloom. When blooms start to decompose, that's when cells break open and you start to see some of the blue pigments that are contained in the cells and are normally hidden by chlorophyll. So kind of the turquoisey color here, very bright color here. This is a mat that was probably brought up off the bottom on the back of this filamentous green algae. So decomposing blooms can actually be a lot of different colors. There's some that are sort of purplish, as that you see here on the left, some that are really light blue, whitish looking. There's some that are sort of a khaki color too. So anytime you see really vividly colored scums or vividly colored water in a lake, be suspicious that it is possibly cyanobacteria and take steps to protect yourself against it. So let's say you have green lake water and you don't know what it is. How can you tell if what you're seeing is planktonic cyanobacteria? Look for these little tiny green specks in the water, or sometimes it'll look like green dust on the surface too, and that is cyanobacteria. There's a simple test you can do at home called the jar test. Take a jar, fill it with some of that green lake water, shake it up, and then allow it to sit undisturbed for a while. And planktonic cyanobacteria are going to float and form a green layer at the surface. Most true algae usually sink. Now, this is not an absolutely foolproof test. Really looking at them with a microscope is the only way to know for sure what things are, but it's a simple way to gauge, okay, this may or may not be cyanobacteria. So yeah, most true algae are going to sink. And Minnesota Pollution Control Agency has a nice document that explains this test. You can look for that on the internet. Just use the words Minnesota jar test. But not everything that's green and floating is actually going to be cyanobacteria, so take a really close look at it. Here you have a jar that's filled with wolfia, or watermeal. Watermeal is actually the world's smallest flowering plant. It has more of a leaf green color and a very regular oval outline on all of these. There are duckweeds in there too, with the roots hanging down. You can see that if you look through the side of the jar. Here's a duckweed with the roots hanging down, little watermeal plant. So look carefully at what that floating green layer actually is. Now, in lakes, pollen can accumulate and look sort of like a cyanobacterial scum, but pollen tends to be pale yellow in color. And one of the things that you can do if you're not really sure is look for that yellow dust on surfaces on land. So on picnic tables and cars, for example. If you see yellow dust on land and on the lake, it's probably going to be pollen. And 2019 is really we seem to have bumper crops of conifer pollen being released. I got these pictures from the Great Lakes, so Lake Michigan, yellow waves, and really vivid yellow waves on Lake Superior. So again, people were alarmed that this might have been a cyanobacterial bloom, but there was a lot of pollen being put out by conifers last year. So what about floating mats? How do you tell what those are? And that same document from Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, you can do the stick test. If you see a floating mat, put a stick in it, pull it out. If it ends up looking like it's covered with green paint, like you see here, that's probably cyanobacteria. However, if it ends up draping over the stick like stringy hair, as you see here and here, it's probably not a cyanobacteria and rather is filamentous green algae. However, there is one exception, so you really have to look at the color. This is Microcyra. This is a cyanobacterial filament, and it's really huge for cyanobacteria. It can get to be several inches long, but you can see that this is more black in color, while filamentous green algae tends to be more green. So look at the color and the texture. So what causes harmful blooms? In an individual lake, it can be very different. There's a complicated interplay of physical, chemical, and biological reasons why a particular lake might have a bloom. But in general, where we see the most significant issues and longer lasting issues is in lakes with excess nutrients, so phosphorus and nitrogen that fertilize bloom growth of cyanobacteria. They can also fertilize plant growth and other algae growth. When we typically see blooms occurring is when water is at its warmest, so mid to late summer into the fall, and when there's calm weather. So calm weather allows planktonic cyanobacteria to float to the surface where they can form really noticeable scums. And reservoirs and impoundments tend to be more vulnerable to blooms just because They tend to be shallow, so water can warm up quickly. If you think about what an impoundment does, you put it in a dam on a river, slows down the water flow. Any sediments and nutrients being transported downstream are slowed down and stopped by that impoundment. So you can intensify the amount of nutrients that are in there. But one thing I really want to emphasize, that any water body can have a bloom because there are cyanobacteria in all water bodies. So what the DNR is doing to prevent HABs, even though it isn't always explicitly stated, is our nutrient reduction efforts, keeping nitrogen and phosphorus on land and out of water bodies. Once those nutrients get into a lake, it's very difficult to remove them and can be very expensive. And it's not just the DNR doing this. It takes a lot of cooperation between municipalities, counties, the agricultural producers themselves, land and watershed groups, UW Extension, and state and federal agencies. So nutrient reduction efforts, it's not just, oh, we'll do it this year and then we'll see results next year. They're not a quick fix, and it can take a significant amount of time to produce results. So it's important to keep nutrients out as a preventative measure for reducing blooms. So if you do have a harmful algal bloom in a lake, what can you do to get rid of it? There are a lot of different methods that are out there, but you have to really carefully evaluate the control methods and see how they would work for your lake. Most of these methods require permits by the DNR, and what we really look for is independent peer-reviewed science. We need that independent vetting of whether that method's effective or not. And we really look for whether we know about the effects on non-target organisms. If you have a method that might knock out a bloom, that's great, but if it's going to kill a lot of zooplankton or have adverse effects on fish behavior, that's really not great, because it's not, we have to look at the lake as a whole. There are a lot of methods that work great in the lab and are can be very effective in small ponds, like isolated golf course ponds, but they're not really workable at scales on the scale of a large lake. So take that into consideration too. And there's a lot of, some of these vendors have a lot of sort of pseudoscientific language around their literature for these methods. So just evaluate that really carefully. It might sound sciencey, but unless you've got that independent peer-reviewed science, be really careful. And one of the things you have to be very careful about is whether that bloom control method can result in toxin release. If you kill a bloom and then that causes all of those cells to die and simultaneously release toxins, if they're producing toxins, that's really not going to be good for the lake. And any effective bloom treatments are likely going to involve multiple methods. And it's important to include reducing nutrient input too, because that really is the source of the problem. There really isn't a silver bullet in most cases for getting rid of blooms. And blooms are becoming more frequent in Wisconsin and worldwide too. We have evidence of that. So these three figures here are from the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts report from 2011, and these show things that have changes that have happened in Wisconsin already from 1950 through 2006. So our average annual temperature in the state is going up, our growing season is increasing, and most of the state is getting wetter. We're getting more precipitation, and these are conditions that can lead to more blooms in the future if these trends continue. Warmer temperatures mean warmer water temperatures, and cyanobacteria grow better at warm temperatures. If you have a longer ice-free growing season, blooms can start growing earlier and get a hold and then last longer into the autumn too. And heavy rains and snowmelt bring extra nutrients into a lake, so this increase in precipitation is going to be really important. And then compared to the period from I think 2000 to 1985, the Midwest is getting a lot more of these single day heavy rain events. So a lot more of these intense storms, and that's something that can bring runoff and associated nutrients into the lakes too. So that's going to be an important factor that may increase blooms in the future. So that's why There are a lot of things that all of us can do to decrease runoff and the associated nutrients into lakes in order to help prevent blooms into the future. Healthy Lakes Wisconsin has some great ideas of different things that homeowners can do to decrease runoff from their property. If you're on a septic system, it's also very important to keep that inspected and maintained, because you don't want nutrients from your septic system coming into the lake via the groundwater. It's also important to manage aquatic plants responsibly. If you have a lot of aquatic plants in a lake, they're actually going to be your ally in reducing prevalence of blue-green algae blooms, because they take up nutrients that would otherwise go into fertilizing growth of cyanobacteria. It's also important to do everything you can to prevent the spread of aquatic invasive species. There's been some work out of Michigan State University that shows that even if your lake has low or moderate nutrient levels, if you have zebra mussels in there, they possibly can help to exacerbate blooms of cyanobacteria. And if you live in a more urban setting, it's important to keep leaves and yard waste out of streets so the nutrients contained in those don't get carried into lakes by storm sewers. So I'm going to really briefly go over exposure routes and toxins. Amanda is going to go over this in more detail. So not all cyanobacteria make toxins, and those that do don't make them all the time. But if they are making them, you can be exposed if you're ingesting lake water, if you're inhaling lake water containing cyanobacteria. So for example, inhaling spray while you're water skiing through a bloom. And some people are also susceptible to skin exposure. And the four groups of toxins we are most concerned about are liver and kidney toxins, so microcystin and cylindrospermopsin. There are also a couple of neurotoxins that are potentially made by cyanobacteria, so those are anatoxins and saxitoxins. There are also dermatotoxins that are in the cell walls of cyanobacteria, so those are the ones that people can have skin reactions to. But again, not all cyanobacteria make toxins, and they don't make them all the time. But the thing that's really challenging around these is that you can't tell if they're making toxins just by looking at a bloom. So you have to really treat any significant accumulation of cyanobacteria with care. I'm going to talk about some areas of research where we don't know a lot right now. So for fish consumption, we don't know a lot about the health risks from cyanotoxins in fish. There's a lot of evidence that shows that toxins may accumulate in the organs, so it's important to really only eat the fillets of the fish and to rinse them really well with clean water before you cook or freeze them. You might notice some taste and odor compounds imparting some off flavors to fish if they're living in lakes that have recurring blooms. Those aren't the actual toxins themselves, they're just some other compounds that are made by cyanobacteria. And if you look for Oregon Health fishing algae, that will get you to the Oregon Health Authority's fact sheet on fish consumption and cyanobacterial toxins. There is also potential for cyanobacterial blooms to be aerosolized by wind or waves and sort of carried long distances from a lake. This is an active area of research. Elizabeth Harahy is one of the researchers at University of Wisconsin Whitewater, so she's been looking into that in Wisconsin, and there is a lab in University of Michigan in Ann Arbor that's been looking at aerosolizing lake water from both the Great Lakes and inland lakes, and they're able to see that yes, there is potential for exposure from basically wind-blown aerosols as well. However, there's a lot we don't know. We don't know what health effects it has, how much you have to be exposed to it, or for how long. So this is really an active area of research. Another area of research is into a compound called beta-N-methylamino-L-alanine. The acronym for that is BMAA. And what this is, it's an amino acid, but it's not typically made to make proteins in organisms. And there is a large research consortium that's international, and they have been working, at least for the last 10 years, on looking at whether there's this link to of BMAA and development of neurodegenerative diseases by chronic exposure. One thing I want to point out is that there are a lot of other environmental exposures that can play a role in developing these diseases. There's been a lot of media attention given to this, which isn't always very nuanced and doesn't actually look very well, or at least express very well, all of the scientific background behind this. The group from the beginning has said that there is possibly a genetic component to people's vulnerability, and that doesn't always come out in a lot of the media coverage about this. I also want to point out that not all of the evidence does support this link between BMA and neurodegenerative diseases. Some of the exposure studies this group has done use levels like far beyond what would be environmentally relevant. So you would basically have to eat 200 years worth of food, for example, to get the exposure levels that would result in some health effects. And Neil Chernoff reviewed this group's work in 2017. This is the link to it, or contact me, I can send you the link. And he and his co-authors concluded that this research group's research did not actually support this link to development of neurodegenerative diseases. So this is a current area of research. Stay tuned, I guess. So given that cyanobacteria can make toxins, how can public health agencies quantify risk? And I want to point out that in Wisconsin, it's not the DNR who would say issue a beach closure for cyanobacteria unless it was on a state park beach or a state forest beach. It's actually, that authority lies with local public health authorities. So in the past, we've used the World Health Organization's recreational guidelines. And I want to point out that this is based on exposure of adults from water containing planktonic blooms. So some of these other things like the floating mats, that's not addressed with this. And because it's based on adult exposure, children are at higher risk than is what is indicated here. So World Health Organization looked at probability of adverse health effects from low to very high from ingesting water containing certain densities of cyanobacterial cells, certain concentrations of microcystin toxin, and chlorophyll if it is a bloom. So this cutoff between moderate and high risk is actually where adults can wade into water. If you can't see your feet in knee-deep water, that indicates a high or very high risk. And this is on the bottom what some of these conditions look like. So moderate risk, kind of greenish water. High risk, you've got that scum starting to show up. And here, this very high risk, this water is very green and opaque. There were 51 million cells per milliliter in that water, so very high. We now also have US EPA recreational guidelines for microcystins and cylindrospermopsin, and this is based on the toxin's effects on target organs, so liver and kidneys, not on acute effects like vomiting and diarrhea. And these do take children's smaller size into account, so these are also protective of adults as well. So we have these from the US EPA now. And where you can get beach closure information, it would normally be through your local municipal or county public health agency or through wisconsinbeaches.wibeaches.us. But for the most part, most public health agencies right now just don't have the capacity to monitor for blue-green algae. And even when lakes are monitored, it's probably only going to be at a public access point like a public beach. So it's really important to assess conditions for yourself before you go swimming, because conditions can change a lot from the time a monitoring sample was collected and when those results are ready. And monitoring can be really challenging because blooms are very patchy in time and space. You can see how this is just a snapshot of what these blooms look like on these lakes in Madison. And the wind can create really highly localized conditions too. So for example, these two pictures were taken on the same lake about an hour time difference. So really dense cyanobacteria here, perfectly clean water elsewhere. So really need to learn to look at the conditions and assess conditions for yourself before you swim. The good thing about the blooms of the highest concern is that you can see them. If there's possibly toxins being concentrated, possibly toxins being produced, you can see the conditions that would lead to possibly high concentrations. It's more of a judgment call if you've got these chunks of material, mats on the surface, or just a really fine dusting on the surface. You have to really take into account people's vulnerability and whether they can keep water out of their mouth. But keep in mind that water is never 100% safe. There's going to be other bacteria, viruses, and parasites in the water that could be present. Now, filamentous green algae don't produce toxins, but if you've got a lot of this material decomposing, you could actually end up seeing excess bacterial growth there. And so you don't really want something that looks like this in your mouth. This is actually a sample from a mat breaking down in the lab, and that's a lot of bacteria. So think about that. Don't swim through anything that's really a lot of organic material breaking down in a lake. So how can you stay safe? Always avoid swimming in and boating through blue-green algal scums and pea soup water. So use that knee-deep test. If you can't see your feet, you need to choose a better place to swim, and definitely keep kids and dogs out. It's also important to choose the clearest water possible for small children and pets, and really try to avoid swimming in shallow, warm, stagnant water bodies. You want to swim in an area where there's better water exchange. Shower off after you swim, and try to avoid swallowing water, because you can have higher bacteria levels even if it looks really clean if there's been a rainstorm recently. So when in doubt, stay out. And it's really important to keep your pets safe. There was a lot of attention given nationally to a number of dog deaths attributed to cyanobacteria poisoning last year. My personal opinion is that some of the media reports, the dog deaths might have actually been from water intoxication, so ingesting too much water, or heat stroke too. So it's important as a dog owner to give your dog frequent breaks from playing in the water. If you've got a retriever that will just retrieve for hours, make them take a break. Use flat objects so they minimize the amount of water they ingest when they're retrieving, and always give them access to shade and cool, clean water. And something to keep in mind, if you irrigate your lawn with lake water and your dogs or cats eat grass, don't irrigate your lawn if there's a bloom present, because you could actually be putting cyanobacteria from the lake onto your lawn, and they might ingest them. And it's important to always supervise dogs and keep them out of unsafe conditions. Don't let them run around on their own. They could go drink lake water. Always choose the clearest, cleanest water you can for them to swim in. And why you want to avoid having dogs swim in these shallow, warm, stagnant water bodies is they could dislodge mats from the bottom, and then they could ingest them too. So try to avoid having them swim in those conditions. Provide clean drinking water. Don't let them drink untreated water, because you're going to also protect them from ingesting other parasites, waterborne pathogens too, and wash them off after they swim so they don't ingest cyanobacteria from their fur. So there's a lot more information on the DNR and the DHS website, so just search for that word algae. DHS, you can actually report illnesses in humans and animals in their reporting form, and you can let me know when you see significant blooms in Wisconsin. You can email those to dnrhabs@wisconsin.gov, and we also have in the works reporting portal on the DNR website as well. I need to know the lake, the town, the county name, the size of the bloom, how long it's been there, and what's really important are photos for verification. So I'm going to stop there and let Amanda take over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gina. Now we're going to switch over to Amanda Cole. And we're going to try and keep some time for questions at the end, but we're going to probably go up to near the end of the time. So folks that want to stay on can stay on, and everyone else can go to the keynote for this morning by going back to Friday's agenda.
All right, well, hello everyone. So thanks for attending my and Gina's presentation today. As mentioned, my name is Amanda and I'm an epidemiologist at the Wisconsin Division of Public Health. The focus of my work is primarily on environmental water issues. And as part of that, a large portion of my time is spent coordinating the division's harmful algal bloom surveillance program. So my presentation today will focus on the health effects of exposure to blue-green algae and the public health approach to dealing with related illnesses here in Wisconsin. All right, so let's begin with the background on the health effects. Now, when we talk about cyanobacteria, as Gina mentioned, we need to understand that they're not all harmful. cyanobacteria actually helped create the Earth's atmosphere as we know it today. There are over 2,600 species that have been described by scientists, and only about 50 of those are actually known to be toxin producers. However, it's important to point out that even those 50 species that do produce toxins don't make them all the time. Now, generally, there are 3 types of cyanotoxins, and we group them based on the effects they have on human and animal health. So hepatotoxins are liver toxins, and they include microcystin and cylindrospermopsin. These are 2 of the most common cyanotoxins we hear about and observe in our water bodies. Neurotoxins can have harmful effects on the nervous system. These include anatoxin A and saxitoxin. And then finally, we can also see some dermatotoxic effects of certain cyanobacterial cell components, such as lipopolysaccharide endotoxins, which can result in skin irritation or a skin rash. Now, the signs and symptoms that develop from exposure to cyanobacteria depend largely on the route or routes of exposure, the species of cyanobacteria we're dealing with and what toxins they produce, cyanobacterial cell and toxin concentrations, and existing vulnerabilities. Certain factors such as behavior, body size, and pre-existing conditions, so for example, like skin sensitivities, can put a human or animal at increased risk not only of becoming exposed, but also becoming ill after the exposure occurs. All right, so how are people exposed to blue-green algae? The most common way we hear about is by participating in a recreational water activity. So for example, by swimming or boating. However, we also hear about exposures resulting from personal use of a water body. So for example, a lake home may use water from the lake to feed their lawn or vegetable garden. And occupational exposures are possible for anyone working on, in, or near a body of water experiencing a bloom. So for example, a person whose job it is to clear invasive plants from along a shoreline. And there are 3 main routes of exposure, or ways that a human or animal can ultimately come in contact with blue-green algae. They can have skin contact with algal scum or mats. They can swallow water with algal toxins in it, and they can also inhale small droplets of water containing cyanobacteria. So if a person comes in contact with algal scum or mats, they might develop a rash, hives, or skin blisters. Rashes might be worse or limited to areas under swimsuits, where the swimsuit acts to hold the algae in contact with the skin for longer periods of time and facilitates the rupture of cyanobacterial cells, which causes the release of intracellular toxins. So pictured here actually is an example of a dermal rash caused by exposure to a marine species of harmful algae. Ingestion of water can result in gastrointestinal symptoms such as abdominal pain, nausea, diarrhea, and vomiting, especially with the liver toxins like microcystin. Ingestion of neurotoxins can result in symptoms similar to those of paralytic shellfish poisoning, which can result in symptoms like numb lips, tingling fingers and toes, and dizziness. Inhalation is the route of exposure when people participate in activities like tubing or water skiing through a bloom. Generally, their mouths are open, and it becomes easy for them to breathe in small water droplets. So when this happens, we might see something like a flu-like illness develop, respiratory irritation, something like asthma-like symptoms. Now, our animals are exposed largely through the same routes as humans, but animals are especially susceptible because they aren't as easily deterred from smelly green water as humans are. They also tend to be smaller in size, meaning that it doesn't take much toxin to make them sick. So when we hear about large fish kills or bird die-offs in a water body experiencing a bloom, we can hypothesize that cyanobacteria and their toxins may be playing a role. And in this way, an animal illness during a bloom can actually serve as a sentinel for possible human illness. Now, dogs are our most common victims, and their behaviors really do play a significant role. Many dogs have gotten sick, and some have died as a result of drinking water, experiencing a bloom, eating or licking scum material along a shoreline, or after licking algae or scum off their fur. Now, because animals need a relatively smaller dose to become ill, severe symptoms are more commonly seen in them and can include respiratory distress and paralysis after being exposed to neurotoxins, as well as seizures, coma, and even death. We can also see liver damage and liver failure after ingestion of liver toxins like microcystin. Now, because toxins are fast-acting agents, onset of symptoms in animals and humans as well generally occurs within minutes to hours following the exposure. And again, which symptoms develop really depend on which toxin is involved. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you a little bit about our Harmful Algal Blooms program here at the Wisconsin Division of Public Health. So our program started in 2008 because that was the year that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, began tracking voluntarily reported cases of HAB-related illness through their surveillance system project known as HABIS. Now, since then, our staff support has been made possible primarily by CDC fellowships and other funding from the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, or GLRI. So as one of 10 pilot states participating in the HABIS project, Wisconsin carried out its activities through a core partnership consisting of the Division of Public Health, the Department of Natural Resources, and the State Laboratory of Hygiene. The HABIS project ended in 2013, but DPH found a way to maintain active surveillance for HAB-related illnesses and build upon the existing HAB program infrastructure and agency partnerships. So 7 years later, DPH today continues to work diligently with the DNR and the state lab in order to investigate HAB-related illness in Wisconsin. And it's always great to put, faces to names. So here you see the three individuals who really make these partnerships possible. So I'm up at the top in my cubicle at DPH. Gina is down on the left, and Dawn is our state lab microbiologist on the right. All right, so in a nutshell, our program conducts surveillance of the health effects related to harmful algal bloom exposure. We investigate reports of human and animal illnesses suspected to be due to HAB exposure. We coordinate water sampling and analysis, usually alongside the DNR. We help local public health issue health advisories and beach closures. And of course, we provide education and outreach about HABs and related illnesses. So how do these activities fit into a typical illness investigation? Well, let's walk through the steps together. So first, DPH receives an illness complaint. Now, we receive complaints of illness in humans and animals, including pets, livestock, and wildlife, by several methods. These include our online case reporting tool on the DPH Blue-Green Algae website, through direct contact with program staff by calling or emailing our program, from referrals from the DNR, local health departments and lake associations, the Wisconsin Poison Center, and now that HAB-related illness is a reportable condition in the state of Wisconsin, from clinicians as well. So here's a screenshot of our DPH Blue-Green Algae website. You can get to it by Googling Wisconsin Department of Health Blue-Green Algae. And you'll see at the bottom of the homepage is a link to be able to report a suspected blue-green algae illness. This method of reporting is very valuable for our program, as nearly a third of our complaints are received through this reporting tool every year. So just to give you some data here, in the 11 years of our program, we received a total of 276 health complaints related to blue-green algae, and that's an average of about 25 per year. And health complaints can be about illness in people or animals, and it really varies per year how many of each we do receive. So after our program receives the health complaint, we begin the investigation by interviewing the patient or the animal owner, gather information on signs and symptoms, and activities and water conditions at the time of the exposure to blue-green algae. If the illness in question sounds like it could potentially be due to cyanobacteria, and if the water conditions are still representative of those at the time of the exposure, so if the bloom is still there, Gina will then work with regional DNR staff to collect water samples. And samples are then collected following a sampling protocol, which does, by the way, instruct field staff to wear rubber gloves during sample collection. Samples are then sent to Dawn at the State Lab of Hygiene, who microscopically identifies and enumerates the cyanobacteria in the sample and conducts toxin testing. After Dawn analyzes the samples, she reports the results back to me and Gina. Then we interpret the level of health risk present and share this information with the local health officer, who can then issue a health advisory closing or restricting access to a beach or swim area impacted by the bloom. Generally, the local health department will work with the DPH HAB program on appropriate messaging, especially to the public, regarding HAB health risks. So here is an example of a health alert developed by our program on the left, and a press release from a local health department on the right. So in the end, our main goal of these HAB investigations is to prevent additional illnesses from occurring. So let's dive into some HAB-related illness case studies so you can get an idea of the kinds of illness reports we receive every HAB season. So we'll go through one human case study and one animal case study. So to begin with our human case study. In August of 2017, DPH received a fax report of a suspected blue-green algae exposure from the Wisconsin Poison Center. The report indicated that a 17-year-old male became ill with gastrointestinal illness the day after recreating in a lake for about 30 minutes. DPH interviewed the family, who indicated that the boy and his father had visited a county park where they had entered the water to play catch with a football. Their activities included swimming and dunking each other below the surface of the water. During the interview, DPH learned that the father was also ill with similar symptoms. Both men experienced headaches within 1 hour of the exposure. The following morning, both developed abdominal cramping and diarrhea that lasted for 24 hours. Neither one reported knowing any friends, coworkers, or family who had recently been ill, and neither sought medical care for their symptoms. The reported conditions at the time of the exposure were murky, green, pea soup water with a rotten egg smell, and the family observed 3 dead floating carp near where they were recreating.
Oh, how dumb do you have to be? That sounds like fun.
Yes, folks, people do swim in this kind of stuff. So by the time DPH was able to reach the family for interview, testing of the lake water for algal toxins was no longer warranted, as the water would not be representative anymore of the conditions at the time of the family's exposure. However, the lake water was tested at the deep hole by citizen monitoring on the day of the exposure. The SECI depth at this location was 2.5 feet, which was the shallowest reported depth during the 2017 monitoring period. The clarity of the water was murky and the color green. So together, these indicators point to a lake that was eutrophic during that time and capable of experiencing a bloom, especially at a shallower shoreline location. So in reviewing these cases, we have signs and symptoms, including their onsets and durations, which were characteristic of cases of HAB-related gastrointestinal illness. In addition, both visual observations reported by the family and environmental data collected by the local citizen monitoring network suggested that a bloom was present during the exposure. Unfortunately, though, lab-based data on cyanobacterial cell and toxin concentrations were not available because the water could not be tested. So in the end, public health classified these as probable but not confirmed cases of HAB-related illness. Okay, moving on to our animal illness case study. So in late July of 2017, DPH was notified by multiple sources regarding 2 dogs that died within 1 hour of each other on the same day after swimming in the same lake. We learned that the dogs had no connection to each other and were owned by different families. The dogs swam at 2 different beaches, approximately 5 miles apart. We knew the lake is well known for bad blooms, but no blooms were visually observed the day the dogs died, and the owner of one dog actually went to the media to warn the public of blue-green algae, which she believed killed her dog. So what happened? At Beach A, a Cavalier King Charles Spaniel was swimming and playing fetch in the water for about an hour. The first sign of illness reported by the owner was a loss of balance in the dog approximately 40 minutes into swimming. During their 10-minute walk home, the dog urinated frequently and had a loose stool. Upon arriving home, the dog began salivating and frothing at the mouth, vomited, and eventually became unconscious. The owner reported that at the time of the dog's exposure, the water looked brown and murky with no signs of an algal bloom. Around the same time, at Beach B, a border terrier was swimming and playing fetch in the water for about 25 minutes. The first sign of illness reported by the owner was staggering and a loss of balance approximately 20 minutes after returning home. Shortly after, the dog began twisting and turning as if in pain, began convulsing, and eventually became unconscious. The owner reported that the water looked brown and murky at the time of the dog's exposure, with no signs of an algal bloom. Now you might remember this slide from earlier. So in addition to our usual partners, this investigation also involved partnerships with the local health department, with local veterinarians, and the local lake association.
We're at 8:45.
So what did each partner do? DPH interviewed the dog owners and served as the point of contact between investigation partners. The DNR collected and analyzed water samples at both beaches where the dogs were exposed. The state lab analyzed water samples as well as the dog's stomach contents for cyanobacteria and cyanotoxins. The local health department did their own collection and analysis of water samples. The local lake association shared results from routine monitoring conducted at one of the beaches on the day of the dog's exposures. And the veterinarians received, examined, and attempted to treat the animals during their ER visits and performed necropsies and additional postmortem testing on both dogs in an effort to search for a cause of death. So what were our findings? Water samples collected at one or both sites the day of and day after the dog's exposures resulted in low cyanobacterial cell counts with either non-detectable or very low levels of cyanotoxins. Stomach contents from both dogs were collected post-mortem on the day following their deaths and were analyzed at state lab for a suite of cyanobacterial toxins. In both specimens, not one cyanotoxin was identified. Post-mortem analyses and necropsies actually ruled out cyanotoxin exposure and identified other possible causes of death. One dog exhibited signs of heart defects and a brainstem herniation, and the other had abnormally low levels of cholinesterase, which can be a sign of pesticide exposure. So in the end, these dogs were deemed not to be cases of hab-related illness. Many of the health complaints our program receives every year turn out not to be related to blue-green algae after all. Now, this particular intensive investigation really highlights the importance of diverse partnerships in investigating suspect cases of hab-related illness, and also how high awareness of algal blooms in a community often affected by them can result in increased reporting and media attention. Okay, so why do we care about HABs? Well, they're an important matter to public health for several reasons. First, we know that HABs are an emerging public health problem worldwide, with areas all over the globe experiencing problems. This picture here is of a bloom impacting the Dnieper River in Kiev, Ukraine. Secondly, the warming effects of climate change are projected to increase the severity, magnitude, and distribution of this problem in the future. And finally, the spectrum of health impacts from HABs is still poorly understood. Because of the transient and unpredictable nature of HABs, most of what we know about the health impacts comes from animal toxicity studies and anecdotal case reports instead of large-scale controlled epidemiologic studies. Thus, we rely on the reporting of cases to us in order to learn more about the kinds of signs, symptoms, risk factors, and health outcomes associated with HAB exposure, so we can learn more about how to prevent these illnesses in the future. So, in order to learn more about HAB-related illnesses, we need to hear about them. Now, we rely on reporting from doctors, veterinarians, and citizens, which means if the illness is not reported, we won't know about it. And there are a few reasons why illnesses may not be reported. First, not everyone in the state is aware of what HABs are, what they look like, that they can cause illness, and what kinds of symptoms exposure can produce. Not surprisingly, we find that people who live in areas with frequent HABs are the most aware, whereas visitors from other parts of the state and non-residents may have little knowledge. Additionally, HAB-related illnesses are very challenging to diagnose. Most symptoms are so vague, they really just sound like a myriad of conditions. Could be swimmer's itch, food poisoning, or even allergies. HAB-related illness does not have a single signature sign or symptom that really clues us in. And then, in most cases, illness is not severe enough to warrant medical attention. Even in cases severe enough to be seen by a doctor or a veterinarian, the level of awareness of HAB-related illness among medical professionals can vary considerably. So therefore, being seen does not guarantee that the practitioner will recognize the illness as being HAB-related. And then finally, there is currently no commercially available diagnostic test that the doctor could run, say for example, on a blood sample, to confirm that your illness was in fact due to HAB exposure. So together, you can really begin to understand how all of these factors can contribute to a potential underestimation of the number of HAB cases seen across Wisconsin and the country.
Folks, we're at 8:50, and those that would like to depart now and go to the agenda to get on for the keynote, you can. And Gina and Amanda have agreed to stay with us and answer your questions up to or just past 9 o'clock.
Sure, and Buzz, could I finish the last few slides? These ones go pretty fast.
Sure, I think folks that have to leave will leave, and those that want to
Sure.
learn more will stick with us, okay?
Thank you. All right, so just to finish up these last few slides here. So as citizens of this beautiful state where we really do care a lot about our lakes, what can we do to help prevent bloom-related illnesses? Well, we can become familiar with the signs and symptoms of HAB-related illness, as well as the risky water conditions. We can educate others about blooms and related illnesses. We can report suspected human and animal illnesses to our local or state public health authority. We can encourage others to report suspected illnesses. And we can report obvious blooms to the Wisconsin DNR. Finally, you can follow some simple precautions to protect yourselves, your family and friends, and your pets from any harmful effects of blue-green algae exposure. Don't swim or allow your kids or pets to swim where water is discolored or where you see foam, scum, or algal mats. Don't boat, tube, water ski, jet ski, or wakeboard through algal blooms. Always shower off after swimming in lakes, rivers, and ponds. Keep pets out of discolored water or where you see foam, scum, or mats of algae. If dogs do swim in scummy water, rinse them off right away and don't let them lick algae off their fur. And always look out for and respect any posted beach closures and health advisories, because they're there for a reason. And if you're ever not sure about what might be in the water, it's always best to err on the side of caution. We like to say, when in doubt, stay out. Now, our HAB program offers some great resources, including fact sheets on how to protect your family and your pets from the harmful effects of blue-green algae. Our newest fact sheet includes a photo guide of specific bloom conditions to avoid, as well as a guide to those bloom lookalikes that Gina talked about earlier, with tips on how to tell them apart. To find these fact sheets and more, please visit our website at dhs.wi.gov and search algae. Finally, our HAB program recently created Wisconsin's first set of public health blue-green algae beach signs, which you might see posted at some of our state's public beaches and boat launches this season. Now, please note that not all locations will have them. So make sure, as Gina stressed, that you always assess conditions yourself before getting in the water. Okay, so to recap, please report blooms without accompanying illnesses to the DNR at dnrhabs@wi.gov. Remember to include descriptions of bloom size, duration, and location with lake, town, and county name, as well as any photos taken both close up and farther away. To report a human or animal illness, please contact your local health department or the Wisconsin Division of Public Health by calling 266-1120. And of course, we do have that online survey for reporting illnesses, which is available at our website. Well, thanks to everyone who joined us today. We will now get ready to answer as many questions as time allows.
We'll go start down through these. Let's start with one from Paul Hausler. Do you recommend the use of Abraxas test strips? We are considering using them during 2020 HAB season.
This is Gina. I know that there have been some issues with the accuracy of the test strips from the manufacturer. It's something they're attempting to address. So if you're using them, I would recommend that you also have some sort of robust QA protocols and actually maybe use alternate methods like ELISA from a lab to verify whether you're getting accurate results. And depending on what you're using this for, one thing I really want to emphasize, people can do this for themselves or lake associations, but you really have to work with your local public health authority if you're going to use those results and communicate that to the public to inform them about whether a beach water is safe or not. There's a lot of information that has to be communicated in an appropriate way about the risks. So I encourage you to work with your local public health authorities if you're doing that testing.
Okay, this is my question number one. Is there any way to utilize natural mussels to feed algae somewhat out of the system?
I don't know about native mussels. Zebra mussels in lakes actually exacerbate the problem. I mentioned the work by Michigan State University. They looked at microcystis blooms and zebra mussels in low and moderate nutrient lakes in Michigan. And the issue with zebra mussels is they selectively feed. They filter everything out of the water, but they're able to spit out cyanobacteria, and then the cyanobacteria just float right back up to the surface of the lake and keep on growing. So it's not something that's really easy to bioengineer, basically.
Okay. Can blooms of algae cause harmful health issues even if it does not scum up with paint-like colors?
Oh, that's a great question. I can start with this. And Gina, if you'd like to chime in after, you can.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, it can. And the reason why is because we often have situations where, well, I guess I shouldn't say often, but what can happen is after a bloom goes away or dissipates, if it was a toxin-producing bloom, those toxins can actually remain in the water. And if there aren't other, impacts to the water, other environmental impacts, like such as, wind or, things that might or waves, things that might otherwise kind of shake up the water and disperse the toxins, you can actually have high levels of toxins remaining in the water after the visible bloom dissipates. So again, you know, this isn't a very common situation, but it can happen. And we actually have had suspected dog illnesses from ingesting water that had high, that we actually tested and had high toxin levels that would make the dog sick, you know, but the water did not look scummy.
And I think it's important, again, in those cases, you just don't want that lake water in your mouth. I mean, I have a microscope. I've seen what's in lake water. I don't want those bacteria in my mouth. And there are other things like viruses, parasites like Giardia. You just don't want to expose yourself in that way. So do everything you can to minimize swallowing water yourself. And the other thing to point out is you want to stay out of those really stagnant conditions too. If you've got not a lot of water exchange in an area where you're swimming, if you do have that situation where the bloom is dissipated but it has released toxins, and those are sitting there, it's more likely to stay put if you don't have a lot of water exchange. So try to stay out of really stagnant conditions too.
Yeah, and I think Gina also had some great slides there about kind of how to protect your dog too. And one of those things that was mentioned was bringing along, you know, some water for your dog. You know, we understand that, you know, dogs are dogs, and you know, they may lap up water. You may not be able to stop them, but for the most part, you know, if you're spending a significant amount of time at a lake, you know, if you bring, you know, some clean, fresh water for your dog. You know, more often than not, they'll actually prefer drinking out of that than the water itself.
All right.
Okay.
Buzz, I'm seeing one question that was reiterated. Can the bacteria or toxins stay active for long periods once they're dried on land, like using lake water on a garden? Yeah, unfortunately they can. Microcystin toxin especially is extremely stable. So if you have dried scums on a lake shore, that toxin can still be hazardous for quite a long time. So if you are living on a lake that has significant bloom issues, I think it's a good idea to maybe choose just treated water to water your garden instead of using lake water. You do run the risk if you're using lake water and you're using a sprinkler of getting cyanobacteria on vegetables just from the spray. And there's been some research at Ohio State University on whether plants can take it up too if they're receiving irrigated water that has toxins in it. So I would probably stay away, to be on the safe side, from using lake water to irrigate my garden if I'm on a lake with significant bloom issues.
Okay, Gina or Amanda, you know, we have many lakes in the States where we've had chronic problems for decades. And this question is, were there any long-term effects of exposure in case studies of humans, like Lake Monoman or Taint or parts of Winnebago, Petenwell, Castle Rock, some of those where we know we've had large systems with long-term problems with harmful blooming algal blooms?
That's a great question. So currently we don't have much data or any data at all really on chronic or long-term health effects of exposure. Primarily, the illness reports that we receive every season are from acute effects. So from people who have swallowed a significant amount of water and then have become ill with gastrointestinal symptoms. You know, same thing with dogs, and we have had a few reports of, you know, throat irritation and other things from, you know, from kind of breathing in some mist containing toxins and whatnot. But in terms of long-term, you know, chronic data, unfortunately, we don't have that at this time.
Okay, I think we better wrap it up, folks. We're a little past 9. Give these presenters a great round of applause at your computer screens. You both did an outstanding job. And I think we can really see how passionate both these presenters are about the work that they get the privilege to do for us in the state of Wisconsin. And if you do have further questions, I'm sure you can Google either one of them, get their contact info. I know Gina's has been put up here in the chat room, and these presentations will be available on YouTube at a later date. So we're going to wrap it up here, folks, and thank you very much for attending this morning.
Okay, thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.